Hey guys, tonight we begin somewhere quieter than usual. A cul-de-sac in suburban America, sometime in the early 2000s, where the lawns are mowed in stripes and every house looks like it's keeping the exact same secret. This isn't a story about castles or pirates or queens with snakes in their bedchambers. It's a story about something a lot closer to home, literally. Because for a lot of families, this story happened 2 doors down, and nobody noticed until it was too late. So before you get comfortable, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy what I do here. A huge thank you to the viewer who suggested this one. Your comments genuinely shape where this channel goes next, so if there's a topic on your mind, drop it below. We're also live on Spotify now, so if you'd rather drift off there, the link's in the description. Now, dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft hum, and get yourself settled in. Tonight we're asking some uncomfortable questions. How does a woman who packs lunches and drives carpool end up addicted to one of the most dangerous drugs in America? How does an entire household keep functioning? Bills paid, kids dropped off, dinner on the table, while something this serious is unravelling behind the laundry room door? How do doctors, neighbours, even husbands miss something this big for so long? And what does it actually look like when a suburban life, the kind built on minivans and soccer practice and granite countertops, quietly comes apart at the seams? Tonight, you become her. The year is 2004. You have a husband upstairs, 2 kids asleep down the hall, and a secret you've gotten frighteningly good at keeping. You live on a street where every house seems to have been poured from the same 3 moulds, just painted in different shades of beige and sage and that strange shade of red that real estate agents call brick but everyone else just calls red. Your house sits at the curve of the cul-de-sac. 4 bedrooms, vinyl siding the colour of wheat coffee, a basketball hoop bolted above the garage that your son uses maybe twice a year, and your husband uses even less than that. There's a flag by the front door that changes with the seasons, snowmen in winter, tulips in spring, because somewhere along the way you decided that was a thing you did now. From the street, it looks exactly like what it's supposed to look like. A young family doing well enough. A lawn that gets mowed in tidy stripes every other Saturday, weather permitting. A driveway with a minivan parked at an angle that suggests someone left in a hurry, and someone else will straighten it out later. Inside, the air smells like dryer sheets and whatever you made for dinner the night before, something with ground beef and a sauce from a jar, because by the time 5 o'clock rolls around, you've stopped pretending you have the energy to do anything more ambitious than that. There's a corkboard in the kitchen covered in school flyers and dentist appointment cards, and a calendar with soccer practices written in a colour-coded system you invented, and only you fully understand. This is the architecture of your life, built one ordinary decision at a time, and for a long time you would have told anyone who asked that you were happy here, genuinely, not performing it, just settled into it the way water settles into the shape of whatever's holding it. The neighbours wave when you take out the trash. You wave back. There's a woman 2 doors down who organises a holiday cookie exchange every December, and you always sign up, and you always show up with something slightly underwhelming compared to everyone else's, and nobody ever says anything because that isn't how this particular street operates. Everyone here has agreed, without ever discussing it directly, to present a version of themselves that's slightly tidier than the truth. It isn't dishonesty exactly. It's just the architecture of suburbia itself. This quiet collective agreement that what happens behind the closed garage door stays behind the closed garage door, and what gets shown to the street is the version with the lawn mowed and the flag changed, and the minivan eventually straightened out. You didn't choose this house because it was extraordinary. You chose it because it was exactly ordinary enough, close to a decent school district, a reasonable commute for your husband, a yard big enough for a swing set you bought used from a family 2 towns over who'd outgrown it. It represented something that felt, at the time, like a rival. Like you had done the things you were supposed to do in the order you were supposed to do them, And this house was the proof of it, sitting there at the end of the street with its tidy stripes and its seasonal flag, waiting for you to come home every evening and step inside and close the door behind you. What none of your neighbours knew, what you yourself didn't fully understand yet, was that this house, this ordinary, unremarkable house in the middle of an ordinary, unremarkable street, was about to become the site of something that would unravel slowly enough that almost no one would notice until it was already well underway. Your husband works in something with a commute and a tie. He loosens the second he's back in the car, sales or insurance or some hybrid of the two that involves a lot of phone calls and a quarterly bonus structure. He explains to you periodically and you nod along to without fully absorbing. He leaves around 7:30 most mornings, travel mug in hand, and comes home somewhere between 6 and 7 depending on traffic and how many of his calls ran long. You have a son who is 7, all elbows and questions, obsessed with a video game character whose name you can never quite remember correctly, and a daughter who is 3 and still naps in the early afternoon, which is the only quiet pocket of your entire day. Your life is built around a calendar that lives on the refrigerator door, covered in appointments written in marker, soccer practice on Tuesdays and Thursdays, dentist checkups twice a year, a paediatrician visit whenever someone develops a cough that won't quit. You pack lunches the night before because mornings are too chaotic to do it then. Sandwiches cut into triangles because your son insists triangles taste better than rectangles. A fact you've stopped arguing with because some battles aren't worth fighting. There's a rhythm to it all, a kind of choreography you've gotten so good at that you barely notice you're performing it anymore. Waking everyone up, getting everyone fed, getting everyone where they need to be, and somewhere in the gaps between all of that, being a wife, being a person with your own name attached to it somewhere underneath all the other roles. The mortgage gets paid on the first of the month, automatically, a number that felt enormous when you signed the paperwork and now just feels like a fact of life, the way weather is a fact of life. Your husband handles the big financial decisions, the retirement accounts, the insurance policies, the things that require spreadsheets, and you handle the daily logistics, the groceries, the school forms, the birthday parties that seem to multiply every September when a new school year starts and a new round of classroom friendships begins. It is, by every visible measure, a normal American life, the kind that doesn't make anyone's eyebrows raise at a dinner party, the kind that fits neatly into the boxes society hands out for what a successful young family is supposed to look like. You love your kids in the specific, exhausting, all-consuming way that doesn't leave much room for anything else, and you love your husband in the quieter, more settled way that comes after several years of marriage, less like fireworks and more like a steady fire that's mostly just there, keeping things warm, not requiring constant tending. There are hard days, the kind every parent has, days where your daughter won't stop crying and your son has a meltdown over the wrong colour cup, and you find yourself standing in the kitchen at the end of it all wondering where exactly your own needs fit into this equation. But hard days are different from broken ones, and right now, in this version of your life, everything is simply hard in the ordinary way that parenting and marriage and mortgages are hard. Nothing more dramatic than that. Nothing that would make anyone, including you, suspect that the ground beneath this entire arrangement was about to shift in a way none of you saw coming. It happens on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, the kind of day that would otherwise leave no trace in your memory at all. You're pulling out of a parking space at the grocery store, a cart full of the usual things, cereal, milk, something for dinner, when another car backing out of the row behind you misjudges the distance and clips your rear bumper. It isn't dramatic. No airbags deploy. No ambulance gets called. Just the dull metallic thud of two cars meeting at low speed, and the immediate flood of adrenaline that follows any unexpected collision, however minor. You and the other driver, an older man who's profusely apologetic, exchange information in the parking lot, both of you a little shaky, both of you assuring each other that everyone seems fine. You drive home with your heart still hammering, replaying the moment over and over, the way you do after any small brush with disaster. By that evening, your neck feels stiff, the kind of stiffness that whiplash produces. Subtle at first, the sort of thing you assume will work itself out with some stretching and a heating pad. It doesn't. Over the following days, the stiffness migrates downward into your lower back, settling into a dull, persistent ache that makes it difficult to bend over the bathtub to wash your daughter's hair, difficult to sit through a full carpool line without shifting uncomfortably in the driver's seat. Your husband encourages you to see a doctor, partly out of concern and partly because there might be an insurance claim involved, and after another week of the pain not improving, you finally make an appointment with your family physician. The same one who's been treating your family for years, who delivered both of your children's vaccination schedules, who knows you well enough to trust your account of your own pain without much skepticism. You expect him to tell you to take some over-the-counter pain relievers and maybe see a physical therapist. Instead, after examining your back and asking you to describe the pain on a scale of 1 to 10, he reaches for his prescription pad. This is the early 2000s, a moment in American medicine when pain management has become its own specialty. When pharmaceutical companies have spent years and enormous sums of money convincing doctors that previous generations had been needlessly stingy with pain relief, that patients deserved to be comfortable, that undertreating pain was itself a kind of medical failure. Your doctor isn't doing anything unusual. He's doing exactly what doctors across the country are being trained and encouraged to do, treating pain aggressively, trusting the assurances from pharmaceutical representatives that these newer medications carry a low risk of addiction when used as prescribed. He writes you a prescription for a moderate dose of an opioid painkiller, hands it to you along with a referral for physical therapy, and tells you the combination should have you feeling better within a few weeks. You drive to the pharmacy that same afternoon, hand over the slip of paper, and wait in one of those uncomfortable plastic chairs while they fill it, watching a toddler nearby pull things off a low shelf, while his mother apologizes to no one in particular. You have no reason at this moment to think of this as anything other than what it appears to be, a reasonable medical response to a real and uncomfortable injury, handled by a doctor you trust, filled at a pharmacy you've used for years, in a system that has not yet revealed to you, or to millions of people exactly like you, what it's about to become. The orange bottle sits on your nightstand for the first time that evening, label printed with your name and a set of instructions you read carefully because you're the kind of person who reads instructions carefully. Take 1 tablet every 4 to 6 hours as needed for pain. You take your first dose before bed, mostly out of curiosity about whether it will actually help, and within half an hour something happens that you don't entirely have words for yet. The ache in your lower back doesn't just dull. It dissolves into something softer, something that feels less like pain management and more like being wrapped in a kind of warmth you didn't know you were missing. There's a heaviness to your limbs that isn't unpleasant, a quieting of whatever low-grade static usually hums beneath your thoughts at the end of a long day with 2 young kids and a household to run. You sleep more deeply that night than you have in months, maybe years, and you wake up the next morning not just physically more comfortable but emotionally lighter in a way you can't quite explain to yourself, let alone anyone else. Over the following days, you take the medication as directed, every 4 to 6 hours, careful to wait the appropriate interval, proud in a small way of how responsibly you're managing this. Your back genuinely does feel better. The physical therapy appointments your doctor referred you to start to help as well. Gentle stretches and exercises that loosen what the collision had tightened. But there's a part of you, a quiet, almost embarrassed part that starts watching the clock as the end of each 4-hour window approaches, not because the pain has returned in full, but because you've started to notice and crave the particular quality of relief the medication provides, a relief that seems to extend beyond your back and into something more diffuse, the low background anxiety of managing a household, a marriage, 2 small children, all of it. You don't think of this as anything alarming. Millions of people take prescribed medications and feel grateful for the relief they provide. That's the entire point of medicine. You tell your husband the prescription seems to be working well, and he's glad to hear it, glad you're not in pain anymore, glad enough that he doesn't ask many follow-up questions about how the medication makes you feel beyond the physical. You go about your days mostly as before: school drop-off, errands, dinner, bedtime. Except now there's this new rhythm layered underneath everything else. A quiet countdown running in the back of your mind toward the next dose. The bottle, when you glance at it, still seems to have plenty of tablets remaining. You have no particular reason yet to scrutinize how quickly that number is shrinking. No reason to suspect that the relationship forming between you and this small orange bottle is anything other than what it appears to be on the surface. A patient following her doctor's instructions, recovering from an injury, grateful for modern medicine's ability to make an uncomfortable few weeks more bearable than they otherwise would have been. Within 10 days, your back has improved considerably. The physical therapist comments on your progress, notes that your range of motion has returned to something close to normal, suggests you might only need a few more sessions before being discharged from her care entirely. This should be good news, and on some level it is, but it arrives alongside a strange and uncomfortable realization. The bottle of pills on your nightstand, the one meant to last through your recovery, is emptying at a pace that doesn't match how much pain you're actually in anymore. You do the math more than once, lying in bed at night while your husband sleeps beside you, counting backward through the days, trying to account for where the tablets have gone. Some of it is explainable. There were a few particularly bad days early on when you took an extra dose, a stressful afternoon when your daughter had a meltdown in the grocery store and your back was screaming, and you justified taking medication slightly ahead of schedule because the pain genuinely was severe. But the explanation only accounts for so much. The truth, the one you're not quite ready to look at directly, is that you've started taking the medication not strictly for pain, but for the feeling it produces, the softening of everything sharp and demanding about your daily life, and that feeling has become something you reach for slightly more often than the original prescription anticipated. You tell yourself this is temporary, a brief overlap while your back finishes healing, nothing that requires concern. You start being more careful about timing, more deliberate about waiting out the full interval between doses, congratulating yourself on this discipline as though it proves there's nothing actually wrong. But the bottle keeps emptying faster than it should, and a particular kind of dread starts to settle in around the edges of your days. The awareness that you'll need to call the doctor's office soon for a refill, and an equally uncomfortable awareness of how much you're looking forward to that refill being approved. You catch yourself, more than once, doing strange little calculations. How many days until the prescription technically should run out? How many tablets you'd need to ration to stretch what remains? Whether it would be possible to take half a dose instead of a full one without really noticing the difference. These are not thoughts you've had about any other aspect of your life before. This kind of careful, anxious arithmetic around access to something. You don't recognize it yet for what it's becoming, because nothing about your life up to this point has prepared you to recognize it. You're a mother who packs lunches and drives carpool and signs up for the cookie exchange every December. People like you'd have said with complete confidence a few months ago, don't end up worrying about running out of pills. And yet here you are, lying awake doing math you can't quite make work, while the orange bottle on your nightstand sits there, lighter than it should be, quietly becoming the centre of gravity around which your days have started, almost imperceptibly, to rearrange themselves. You make the call on a Wednesday morning after the kids have been dropped off, sitting at your kitchen table with the empty orange bottle in front of you, like some kind of evidence you're presenting to yourself. The receptionist who answers knows your voice by now, has fielded enough calls from your household over the years about the kids' ear infections and your husband's seasonal allergies that there's an easy familiarity to the exchange. You explain that you need a refill on your pain medication, that your back is still bothering you more than expected. A small lie that comes out more smoothly than you'd anticipated. She doesn't ask many questions. This is the early 2000s, a moment when prescription monitoring databases that might flag early refills or cross-reference multiple pharmacies are either non-existent or in their earliest, clunkiest stages, when doctors are trained to trust their patients' reported pain levels rather than treat every refill request as a potential red flag. The receptionist tells you she'll have the doctor review the chart and call in a refill, and within the hour the pharmacy notifies you that it's ready. You drive over to pick it up with a strange cocktail of emotions churning in your stomach, relief that the immediate problem of an empty bottle has been solved, and underneath that relief, a quieter, more uncomfortable feeling that you don't examine too closely. Something that might be called shame if you were willing to name it, but you're not yet. The pharmacist hands over the bag with the same routine friendliness as always. No scrutiny, no questions. Just another prescription among the dozens she fills every day. You think, as you drive home with a new bottle sitting in the passenger seat, about how easy that just was. How the entire system, your doctor's trust, the receptionist's lack of suspicion, the pharmacist's routine efficiency, simply worked exactly as it was designed to work, and how strange it feels that something you know, on some level, isn't entirely honest could move through that system so smoothly without a single person raising a question. You tell yourself this will be the last time you need an early refill, that you'll be more disciplined going forward, that your back really is healing and soon you won't need any of this at all. You half believe it. The other half of you, the part doing the late-night arithmetic, the part that started to notice how your mood shifts in the hours before a dose compared to the hours after, knows that something has changed in the relationship between you and this medication, something that goes beyond simple injury recovery, though you still don't have language sturdy enough yet to describe what that something actually is. For now, the new bottle sits in your purse, and you go about the rest of your day, picking up your daughter from preschool, starting dinner, helping your son with a worksheet about counting by twos, performing the ordinary choreography of motherhood while carrying, just beneath the surface, a secret that's still small enough to fit inside an orange bottle, though it won't stay that size for very much longer. You sit in a metal folding chair in the school gymnasium on a Thursday evening, surrounded by a dozen other mothers and the occasional father, all of you gathered for the monthly Parent-Teacher Association meeting, the kind of event you've attended faithfully since your son started kindergarten. Tonight's agenda includes a discussion about the fall fundraiser, a debate over whether this year's theme should be a bake sale or a more ambitious silent auction, and a brief presentation from the school nurse about an updated head lice policy that nobody particularly wants to think about. You volunteer, as you usually do, to help organise the bake sale table, your hand going up almost automatically, the way it always does. Because this is who you are in this room, the reliable one, the one who shows up. What none of the women sitting around you know, what none of them have any reason to suspect, is that 20 minutes before walking into this gymnasium, you sat in your car in the school parking lot and took a dose of medication, not because your back was hurting in that particular moment, but because you'd started to notice that without it, sitting through an hour of conversation about bake sale logistics felt almost unbearably difficult. Your patience thinner than it used to be, your ability to perform polite interest in cupcake flavours strained in a way it never used to be. The medication smooths all of that over. It makes the folding chair more comfortable, the fluorescent gymnasium lighting less harsh, the conversation about silent auctions more tolerable than it has any reasonable right to be. You laugh at the right moments. You contribute a suggestion about pricing the raffle tickets that the group seems to genuinely appreciate. By every external measure, you are simply a slightly tired but perfectly functional suburban mother, participating in the unglamorous machinery of school fundraising the way thousands of women across the country are doing in gymnasiums, just like this one on this exact same Thursday evening. This is one of the strange and quietly devastating features of what's happening to you. The way it doesn't announce itself, the way it allows you to continue showing up, continue volunteering, continue being recognised by your community as dependable and present, while something underneath all of that dependability has begun to shift its shape entirely. You drive home afterward with a vague headache and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from performing normalcy for several hours straight, an exhaustion that has nothing to do with how late the meeting ran, and everything to do with the effort of managing two separate realities simultaneously, the one everyone else can see and the one only you know about. Your husband asks when you get home how the meeting went, and you tell him it was fine, the usual stuff, bake sale, lice policy, nothing exciting. And he nods and goes back to whatever he was watching on television, and neither of you has any reason to suspect that the woman who just walked through the door carrying a tote bag full of fundraiser paperwork is also, quietly and without any outward sign of it, carrying something far heavier than that. It happens on a routine follow-up appointment scheduled to check in on your back since the original accident. Your doctor reviews your chart, notes that according to his records you should have plenty of medication remaining from your last refill, and asks, not unkindly but with a hint of professional curiosity, why you're requesting another one so soon. You'd rehearsed an explanation in the car on the way over, something about a particularly bad flare-up after helping move furniture, but the words come out less convincingly than you'd hoped, and you can see something shift behind your doctor's eyes as he listens, a small recalibration of how he's reading this conversation. He examines your back again, notes that your range of motion looks essentially normal, that the physical therapist notes from your discharge several weeks ago described full recovery, and gently but firmly tells you that he doesn't think continuing the prescription is medically appropriate at this point. He suggests over-the-counter alternatives if you're still experiencing occasional discomfort, recommends you continue with the stretching exercises the physical therapist taught you, and closes your chart with a note you can't see but can sense is being made, some small flag in the margins of your medical record that will follow you forward in ways you don't yet understand. You thank him, smile, tell him of course, that makes sense. You appreciate his thoroughness, performing exactly the kind of gracious acceptance a good patient is supposed to perform. Then you walk out to your car in the parking lot, sit down behind the wheel, and feel something close to panic rising in your chest, a sensation entirely disproportionate to what just happened, which was, on the surface, simply a doctor declining to refill a prescription for an injury that has genuinely healed. But your body and your mind have stopped operating according to the logic of the injury weeks ago. They're operating according to a different logic now, one centered entirely around the question of how you're going to manage the hours and days ahead, without the substance that's become, gradually and almost invisibly, the thing holding your entire emotional architecture together. You sit in that parking lot longer than you should, given that you're supposed to pick up your daughter from preschool in 40 minutes, running through options in your head with a clarity and urgency that frightens you, even as you're doing it. There must be another doctor. There must be another way. You don't yet have a name for what's happening inside you, this frantic, narrowing focus that's crowding out almost every other thought. But you recognize somewhere underneath the panic that this reaction itself is information, that no one panics this completely over a denied refill for a medication they don't actually need. You start the car eventually, wipe your face, check the rearview mirror to make sure you look presentable enough to pick up your daughter without alarming anyone, and pull out of the parking lot already turning over names in your mind. Urgent care clinics, walk-in centres, anywhere that might not yet know what your family doctor now apparently does. Over the following weeks, you become a student of a system you didn't know existed until you needed it. This is well before prescription monitoring programs link pharmacies and physicians together in real time, before a doctor in one clinic can easily see what a doctor across town prescribed you the week before. The fragmentation that exists in healthcare during this period, something that would later become one of the most discussed failures of the early opioid crisis, becomes your unintentional lifeline. You discover a walk-in urgent care clinic about 20 minutes from your house, the kind of place designed for sprained ankles and minor infections, where doctors rotate frequently and rarely have the luxury of detailed patient histories. You describe a vague, ongoing back issue, mention the original car accident from months ago, and watch as a physician you've never met before, working through a packed waiting room, writes you a prescription without much hesitation. You learn the particular vocabulary that works, the careful balance between describing real-sounding pain and not seeming so dramatic that it raises suspicion. You learn which clinics ask more questions and which ones move quickly. You start keeping a mental map of your county that has nothing to do with grocery stores or school districts, and everything to do with which doctors might write what you need. There's a particular kind of shame that settles into you during this period, quiet and constant, the awareness that you've become someone who lies to medical professionals, someone who manipulates a system built on trust in order to manage something you still can't fully name. You tell yourself, in your more honest moments, that this isn't who you actually are, that this is a temporary detour, that once you get through whatever this current rough patch is, you'll stop. You'll go back to being the woman who only ever needed medication exactly as prescribed. But each successful visit to a new clinic teaches you that the detour is wider and more accessible than you expected, that the system has more gaps in it than safeguards, and that learning to navigate those gaps has become, disturbingly, one of your primary unspoken skills. Your husband doesn't know about any of this. Your friends don't know. The other mothers at school pickup, the women at the PTA meetings, the family at church you sit near every Sunday, none of them have any idea that the woman they know as reliable and put together has developed an entirely separate, carefully maintained relationship with the healthcare system, one designed solely to keep a steady supply of medication flowing into a life that, from the outside, continues to look exactly as it did before. You keep the receipts and pharmacy printouts hidden in a shoebox at the back of your closet, beneath a stack of old maternity clothes you've never quite gotten around to donating, a small, growing paper trail documenting a version of yourself that exists in parallel to the one everyone else sees. Two women living in the same house, sharing the same bed, raising the same children, only one of whom is fully visible to the people who love her. Eventually, even the network of walk-in clinics starts to show its limits, certain doctors recognizing your face after a second or third visit, certain receptionists asking slightly more pointed questions about your medical history. You begin spreading your prescriptions across pharmacies as well as doctors, learning that filling everything at the same neighborhood pharmacy, where the pharmacist knows your children's names, creates a pattern too easy to notice. You start driving further than you ever used to for what should be a simple errand, to pharmacies in towns where nobody recognizes you, where you're just another customer handing over a slip of paper and a copay. There's a particular pharmacy 3 towns over, attached to a large chain store, that becomes one of your regular stops, anonymous enough that you can fill a prescription there without making small talk, busy enough that the staff barely glances up from the register. You start to notice with a kind of detached clarity how much of your week is now organized around logistics that have nothing to do with your children's schedules or your household's actual needs, mental maps of which pharmacies you've used recently, how much time needs to pass before you can return to one without seeming suspicious, which credit card statement might raise a question from your husband if the charges show up too close together. You tell yourself this is simply being careful, being responsible, spreading things out the way any organised person would. You do not yet have the language for what this actually is. The slow, methodical architecture of a habit that has begun directing your choices more than you direct it. There's a particular kind of exhaustion in maintaining all of this, an entire secondary occupation running underneath your actual life, one that requires planning, memory, and a level of deception you'd never have imagined yourself capable of a year earlier. Some days, sitting in the parking lot of that pharmacy 3 towns over, waiting for your prescription to be filled, you catch a glimpse of yourself in the rearview mirror and feel a flicker of something like recognition, an awareness that the woman looking back at you is becoming someone increasingly unfamiliar, increasingly distant from the version of herself who used to feel proud of being dependable and honest. You push the thought away, the way you've learned to push away most thoughts that threaten to interrupt the careful machinery you've built. There's a school pickup in 40 minutes. There's dinner to make. There's a husband who will be home by 6:30 expecting the same wife he married, the same mother his children expect, and so far, by every visible measure, that's exactly who walks through the door each evening, even as the woman underneath that familiar exterior continues drifting further from shore than she ever intended to go. The math by this point has become unsustainable in a way you can no longer ignore. Pills are expensive when you're paying out of pocket at multiple pharmacies without insurance covering the full cost each time, and your body's tolerance has grown steadily, requiring more medication to produce even a fraction of the relief it once did with far less. You find yourself doing increasingly desperate calculations, considering which household bills might be delayed by a few days, which expenses might be quietly trimmed, all in service of maintaining a supply that keeps slipping further out of reach, no matter how resourceful you become. It's during this period, in a conversation you'll later wish you could erase entirely, that a word comes up that has nothing to do with pharmacies or prescriptions. You're not entirely sure how the conversation arrives there, something said by an acquaintance of an acquaintance, a passing comment about how some people find it cheaper and easier to get what they need without all the doctor visits and pharmacy runs. Heroin. The word sits there in the air between you and the person who said it, ordinary and unremarkable in their tone, as though they were recommending a different brand of laundry detergent. You don't say yes in that moment. You don't say anything at all, actually. Just nod vaguely and change the subject. Drive home with your hands gripping the steering wheel slightly tighter than usual, turning the word over in your mind the way you might turn over a stone you're not sure you want to pick up. You tell yourself with real conviction that this is a line you would never cross, that whatever has happened to you over these past months, however far you've drifted from the woman you used to be, there's still a meaningful difference between misusing a doctor's prescription and using something that exists entirely outside any medical or legal framework at all. You hold on to that distinction the way you might hold on to a guardrail, convinced it will keep you from going any further than you already have. But the distinction, you'll come to learn, exists more clearly in your mind than it does in the actual mechanics of addiction, which doesn't recognize the careful moral hierarchies you're constructing, which doesn't care whether the substance in question came from a pharmacy or somewhere else entirely, only that your body has developed a need that's becoming harder and harder to satisfy through the increasingly narrow and expensive channels available to you. The word follows you home that evening, sits with you through dinner, through bath time, through the bedtime stories you read to your children in the same soft, steady voice you've always used, even as something inside you has begun, almost imperceptibly, to reconsider whether that guardrail is really as solid as you've been telling yourself it is. The first time isn't dramatic in the way movies might suggest. There's no dim room, no dramatic lighting, no needle, nothing that resembles the imagery most people carry around in their heads when they imagine this particular moment. It happens in someone's kitchen, mid-afternoon, while your kids are at school, a powder and a method that has nothing to do with the imagery you've absorbed from television over the years. Something far more mundane and therefore far more possible than you'd assumed. You tell yourself, even as it's happening, that this is temporary, a bridge back to the pills that are becoming too difficult and expensive to maintain, not a destination in itself, simply a more practical solution to an immediate problem. The effect, when it comes, is both familiar and entirely new. Familiar in the way it mirrors the relief the pills used to provide, new in its intensity, in how completely it seems to answer a need you'd started to feel had no answer left. You drive home afterward in a kind of daze, hyper-aware of every other car on the road, certain that something about your appearance must give away what you've just done. Though when you check your reflection in the rearview mirror to red light, you look, disconcertingly, exactly the same as always. You pick up your children from school that same afternoon, help with homework, make dinner, put them to bed, performing every familiar ritual of motherhood with a competence that surprises even you, given what's just happened a few hours earlier. This is one of the most disorienting aspects of what you've just done, the discovery that crossing a line you'd always assumed would be visible, would announce itself somehow, would feel like falling off a cliff, instead feels almost disappointingly ordinary. A Tuesday afternoon that ends the same way most Tuesday afternoons end, with bath time and a bedtime story and a goodnight kiss. You don't yet understand that for many people, this particular bridge becomes, with disturbing speed, indistinguishable from the road itself, that the temporary solution you've convinced yourself you're using has a structure and a chemistry that doesn't particularly care about your intentions or your careful internal distinctions between this and what you were doing before. That night, lying in bed next to your husband, who sleeps soundly beside you, with no idea that anything in his wife's life has shifted today in a way that will eventually touch every corner of his own, you feel a strange combination of relief and dread. Relief that the immediate physical need has been addressed. Dread at how easily, how almost casually you just did something you would have considered only months earlier, completely unthinkable. You tell yourself you'll only do this once, that it was simply a stopgap during an unusually difficult week, and you almost believe it, the way you've almost believed every reassurance you've offered yourself over these past months, each one slightly less convincing than the last. Each one a smaller and smaller foothold on a slope that keeps getting steeper beneath you. There's a particular kind of loneliness that settles into a minivan with 2 empty car seats in the back, parked in some quiet corner of a strip mall parking lot, far enough from the entrance that nobody walking to their car would have reason to glance inside. This becomes a place you return to with growing regularity, a stretch of asphalt between a dry cleaner and a shuttered video rental store, where you sit alone during the narrow windows of time when your children are in school and your husband is at work, doing something in the privacy of your own vehicle that you would never, under any circumstance, want either of them to witness. The radio plays something forgettable, a song you'd normally hum along to without thinking, now reduced to background noise beneath the more pressing business at hand. The afternoon sun comes through the windshield in ordinary golden light, the kind that makes everything look slightly more cinematic than it has any right to, and there's something almost surreal about the contrast between that light and what's actually happening inside the car it's illuminating. You've developed, without ever consciously deciding to, an entire set of habits around these parking lot interludes. Specific locations you rotate between so as not to become a recognizable fixture anywhere. Specific times of day calculated around school pickup schedules with margins built in for unexpected delays. There's a particular brand of granola bar wrapper you keep in the cup holder, evidence, if anyone ever asked, of nothing more than a quick snack, should anyone glance into your car at the wrong moment. You've become, in other words, an expert in a kind of operational planning that has nothing to do with the carpool logistics and grocery lists that used to occupy your mental energy. An entirely new category of competence developed in service of keeping a secret you can no longer imagine your life without. The drive home from these parking lots follows its own particular rhythm. Windows cracked slightly regardless of the weather, a piece of gum chewed methodically, a mental checklist run through to make sure nothing about your appearance or your car would give anything away to the people waiting for you at home. You arrive at school pickup on time, smile at the other parents gathered at the gate, ask your son about his day in a voice that sounds, even to your own ears, indistinguishable from how it always has. There's something almost unbearable about how seamlessly this all fits together. The parking lot and the school gate occupying the same afternoon, separated by only a few miles and a few minutes, as though the two halves of your life have learned to exist alongside each other, without either one disrupting the other's surface. You used to think vaguely, in the way most people think about things that seem abstract and far away, that addiction looked a certain way, that it announced itself, that it made itself visible to anyone paying attention. Sitting in a minivan with car seats in the back in a quiet parking lot bathed in ordinary afternoon sunlight, you're beginning to understand, with a clarity that frightens you, just how wrong that assumption was, and how completely something can hide itself inside the most ordinary corners of an ordinary life without anyone, including the person living it, fully recognizing what it's become. You become, over time, a quiet expert in timing, the kind of precision that would be impressive in almost any other context. You know exactly how many minutes you have before the school bell rings, exactly how long the drive from your usual stopping point takes, exactly what time your husband's car typically turns onto the street in the evening, down to a 15-minute window you've tracked carefully enough to schedule around. Your entire day becomes a kind of invisible architecture built to accommodate something nobody else can see. Every errand, every appointment, every seemingly ordinary stretch of free time secretly calculated against the needs of a habit that has, by this point, become load-bearing in your daily structure. You arrive at the carpool line each afternoon at your usual spot. Third car back from the crosswalk, the same position you've occupied for months, exchanging the same friendly small talk with the mother in the minivan ahead of you, whose name is Denise, and whose son is in your son's class, and who has absolutely no reason to suspect that the woman she chats with about weekend plans and weather is managing something far more complicated than either of them would discuss over the rolled-down windows of their cars. There's a particular skill involved in this kind of constant low-level performance, a skill you didn't know you possessed until circumstances required you to develop it. You learn to read your own face in the rearview mirror before stepping out to greet your children, checking for anything that might look off, anything that might prompt a question you don't want to answer. You learn which of your usual outfits photograph well enough in your own self-assessment to pass as ordinary, which scarves or long sleeves might be useful on days when your arms need covering for reasons you don't examine too closely. You become fluent in deflection, in small talk that reveals nothing, in the particular cadence of a voice that sounds engaged and present, even when the person speaking is operating from somewhere several layers beneath the surface she's presenting. Your son climbs into the car each afternoon with his backpack and his stories about recess, oblivious, as children generally are, to anything beyond his own immediate world, and you listen to him with what feels, even to you, like genuine attention, asking follow-up questions, laughing at the parts meant to be funny, being in every observable way a present and engaged mother. This is perhaps one of the cruelest aspects of what's happening. The discovery that you can continue being a good enough mother, a present enough mother, even while carrying something inside you that would, if it were visible, terrify everyone who loves you. You drive home from carpool each day with your children chattering in the back seat, the late afternoon light slanting through the windows, and you hold both realities simultaneously. The ordinary sweet texture of an afternoon with your kids and the quieter, more insistent pull of something else entirely. something you've gotten disturbingly skilled at keeping folded up small enough to fit invisibly into every corner of days that, to anyone watching from the outside, look exactly like they're supposed to. Your household budget, once a fairly straightforward affair managed in a shared checkbook ledger and reviewed together once a month over coffee, begins to bend in ways your husband notices before you're ready to explain. There's less in the checking account than there should be after grocery runs that seem, according to the receipts, smaller than what you've actually spent. There's a credit card statement you intercept from the mailbox before he gets home, scanning it quickly for charges you need to account for, developing a familiarity with your own financial records that has nothing to do with budgeting and everything to do with damage control. You become, in this period, oddly creative with numbers in a way that echoes, uncomfortably, the creativity you used to apply to school, fundraiser spreadsheets and birthday party budgets. Except now the stakes involved are something you can't bring yourself to fully name, even in the privacy of your own thoughts. Your husband mentions one evening over dinner, in a tone more curious than accusatory, that the grocery bill seems to have crept up significantly over the past couple of months, and you offer an explanation about rising food prices, about the kids going through a growth spurt and eating more, an explanation that sounds reasonable enough on its surface, and that he accepts without much further questioning, because why wouldn't he? There's no reason yet in his mind to suspect that the wife he's known for years, the one who's always been careful with money, who clips coupons and compares unit prices at the grocery store, might be funneling household funds towards something that has nothing to do with feeding their family. You start picking up small amounts of cash here and there, claiming to need money for school supplies or a birthday gift for one of your children's classmates, small enough requests that they don't raise suspicion individually, but that, added together, begin to represent a meaningful drain on the family's resources. There's a particular kind of guilt that accompanies this part of the story, different from the guilt of the lies themselves, a guilt rooted in the awareness that the money disappearing from your shared accounts is money that should be going toward your children's needs, toward the mortgage, toward the life you and your husband built together, with the explicit understanding that you are both contributing to something larger than either of you individually. You tell yourself, in moments of clearer thinking that arrive less and less frequently, that you'll find a way to make this sustainable, that you'll cut back somewhere else, that the math will eventually work itself out the way household budgets always seem to, somehow, eventually, balance. But the math doesn't balance. Not really. Not when one side of the ledger is being driven by a need that grows rather than shrinks the more it's fed. Late at night, after your husband has fallen asleep, you sometimes find yourself sitting at the kitchen table with a checkbook open in front of you, doing arithmetic that has nothing to do with grocery prices and everything to do with how much longer you can keep this particular version of your life functioning before the numbers stop cooperating entirely, before someone, eventually, notices that the family's finances have started telling a story that doesn't match the one you've been carefully presenting to everyone around you. Withdrawal doesn't wait for a convenient time to arrive, doesn't consult your household schedule before deciding when to make itself known. It comes most reliably in the early morning hours, somewhere around 5:30 or 6 before your husband's alarm, before the kids stir, before the day has technically begun, an ache that settles deep into your bones accompanied by a wave of nausea that sends you quietly slipping out of bed and into the bathroom, careful to close the door softly enough not to wake anyone. You sit on the cold tile floor in those early hours more times than you'd ever admit to another living soul, sweating despite the chill, your stomach in knots, every muscle in your body aching in a way that feels less like ordinary illness and more like betrayal, your own body turning against you in ways you're only beginning to understand. You learn the particular timeline of these mornings with the same precision you've applied to everything else in this secret architecture of your life, knowing roughly how long the worst of it will last, knowing what small things might help take the edge off enough to function, knowing exactly how long you have before you need to be presentable enough to handle breakfast and backpacks, and the ordinary chaos of getting 2 children out the door on time. There's a particular kind of discipline involved in managing this in silence, in making sure that by the time your husband's alarm goes off, you're back in bed or in the kitchen starting coffee, looking enough like yourself that he has no reason to ask whether anything's wrong. You become skilled at applying concealer beneath eyes that look more hollow than they used to, at keeping your voice steady through the particular roughness withdrawal leaves behind, at pushing through a haze of physical misery to ask your son about his spelling test or remind your daughter to grab her favourite stuffed rabbit before they leave for school. The house wakes up morning after morning to a mother who looks, mostly like herself, cheerful enough, present enough, functional enough that nobody around the breakfast table has reason to suspect the quiet battle that occurred just an hour or 2 earlier on the bathroom floor. This particular kind of suffering, hidden and managed and folded carefully away before anyone else's day begins, becomes one of the loneliest aspects of everything you're carrying. There's no one to tell. There's no morning ritual of complaint or comfort the way there might be with an ordinary illness. No husband bringing you tea or asking if you need anything, because as far as he knows, there's nothing to bring tea for. You manage these mornings entirely alone, again and again, becoming an expert in a kind of suffering so private it might as well not exist to anyone but you, even as it shapes the architecture of every single day that follows it. The careful pacing, the watching of the clock, the quiet, constant awareness of how many hours remain before you'll need to address, once again, the thing that started almost imperceptibly to run your life from underneath the surface. Your son's recreational league has a Saturday morning game, the kind of event that fills suburban fields across the country with foldable lawn chairs, sideline coffee cups, and parents cheering with varying degrees of enthusiasm for 7-year-olds who are mostly running in the wrong direction. You're there in your usual spot, lawn chair unfolded next to the other team parents, cheering when your son manages to kick the ball anywhere near the opposing goal, chatting during the slower stretches of the game about the upcoming end-of-season pizza party. You're managing on this particular Saturday on less sleep than usual, having spent part of the previous night dealing with the now familiar discomfort that arrives when you've gone slightly too long between doses, and the effort of appearing fully present and engaged is taking more out of you than it normally would. One of the other mothers, someone you've known casually for a couple of seasons now, glances over at you partway through the second quarter and asks with genuine concern whether you're feeling okay, mentioning that you look a little pale, a little tired. You feel a small jolt of alarm at being noticed, at the gap between how you're managing to perform and how you're actually feeling becoming visible enough that someone else has picked up on it. You offer the explanation that's become reflexive by now, that you didn't sleep well, that the kids have been waking up at odd hours lately, an explanation that isn't entirely untrue, even if it leaves out the actual reason behind your exhaustion. She nods sympathetically, mentions her own struggles with her toddler's sleep schedule, and the conversation moves on easily enough, the moment passing without further scrutiny. But something about the exchange stays with you for the rest of the game. A small crack in the careful performance you've built, evidence that the gap between your public self and your private reality is becoming visible at the edges, even to people who have no particular reason to look for it. You watch your son from the sideline cheering when he finally connects with the ball in a way that sends it rolling toward the correct goal, feeling a genuine surge of pride and love that exists somehow alongside everything else you're carrying. Proof that whatever else is happening to you, your capacity to love your children hasn't disappeared, even as your capacity to be fully present with them has started to erode in ways neither they nor you can fully measure yet. After the game, you help fold up the lawn chairs, exchange the usual pleasantries with the other parents about next week's schedule, and drive home with your son chattering happily in the back seat about his one decent kick, replaying it for you in exhaustive detail. You listen, you respond, you ask the right follow-up questions, performing the role of an attentive, present mother with a skill that has become, disturbingly, second nature, even as a quiet unease settles over you about how visible the cracks in that performance might be becoming, and how much longer you'll be able to keep them from widening into something everyone can see. It doesn't happen the way you might have imagined, with a dramatic confrontation staged in a doorway, accusations hurled across the kitchen. It's quieter and stranger than that, the kind of slow accumulation of small, individually explainable details that suddenly, without warning, arrange themselves into a pattern your husband can no longer ignore. He notices a missing bottle of pain medication he didn't realize you still had, finds a strange phone number in your call history that he doesn't recognize and that you fumble to explain when he asks, catches a look on your face one evening, distant and unreachable in a way that's becoming increasingly familiar to him, even if he hasn't yet found the words to describe what he's been noticing. The night it finally comes together happens after the kids are asleep. Your husband sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of bank statements he's pulled together, the careful, methodical energy of someone who's spent days quietly gathering evidence, rather than confronting suspicion directly. He asks you to sit down. His voice carries a steadiness that frightens you more than anger would have, the particular calm of someone who has already worked through the worst of his shock privately, and arrived at the conversation determined to get answers rather than simply express feelings. He lays out what he's noticed, the missing money, the strange hours, the changes in your mood and appearance that he's been quietly cataloguing for longer than you realized, and asks you directly what's going on. There's a moment, sitting across from him at the table where you've eaten thousands of ordinary family dinners, where you consider denying everything, offering one more explanation, one more careful piece of misdirection. But something in his face, the exhaustion and fear and lingering love all tangled together in his expression, makes the lie feel suddenly unbearably heavy, heavier than the truth itself. You tell him. Not everything, not all at once, but enough. The pills, the doctor shopping, the word you'd promised yourself you'd never say out loud. The thing that came after the pills stopped being enough. You watch his face as you speak. Watch it move through disbelief and devastation, and something that looks almost like grief. The particular grief of realizing the person you've built a life with has been living an entire secret existence alongside the one you thought you shared completely. The conversation that follows lasts long into the night, raw and difficult in ways neither of you has language adequate for. Questions about how long, about whether the children are safe, about what happens now, about whether the woman sitting across from him is someone he still recognizes. There's no resolution reached that night, no clean plan for moving forward, just the exhausted, devastating clarity of two people staring at a version of their marriage and their family that looks nothing like what either of them thought they were building. You go to bed that night lying next to a husband who doesn't reach for you the way he normally would, both of you staring at the ceiling in a darkness that feels different from every other night you've shared this bed. The secret finally out in the open between you, the shape of everything that comes next, still entirely, terrifyingly unknown. Your sister flies in from out of state on short notice. Your mother sits stiffly on the couch you and your husband picked out together years ago, back when furniture shopping felt like one of the harmless, ordinary milestones of building a life together. Your husband sits beside you, though not too close, holding a few pages of notes he wrote the night before, his handwriting visible at the edges of the paper, his hands trembling slightly as he glances down at them. This is the intervention you didn't see coming, organized in the days following the conversation that changed everything. The people who love you most gathered in your own living room to say, out loud in front of each other, exactly how much they've noticed and how frightened they've become. Your mother speaks first, her voice catching in a way you've rarely heard from her, describing small moments over the past month that she'd noticed, but talked herself out of worrying about, the times you seemed distracted on the phone, the visit where you disappeared into the bathroom for what felt like an unusually long time. Your sister talks about a conversation months earlier where something about your tone had unsettled her, a worry she'd pushed aside because it seemed easier than confronting it directly. Your husband reads from his notes, his voice breaking partway through, describing nights he'd lain awake wondering what was happening to his wife, describing his fear not just for you, but for what this might eventually mean for your children. Words that land somewhere deep in your chest with a force that makes it hard to breathe. You sit across from the people who love you most and listen to them describe a version of yourself you've been trying desperately not to see clearly. A woman who has become, without entirely meaning to, someone increasingly unreachable, increasingly dishonest, increasingly absent even when physically present. There's no yelling in this room, no dramatic accusations, just a quiet, devastating accumulation of love and fear laid out across the same coffee table where you usually set down mugs of coffee and your children's homework. The ordinary furniture of your life serving as the backdrop for one of its most extraordinary and painful conversations. You cry through most of it, not in the performative way you might have once used to deflect difficult conversations, but in a way that feels like something finally breaking open after months of careful, exhausting containment. By the end of the conversation, a plan has begun to take shape. Treatment options your husband has already researched, a facility a few hours away with an opening in the coming days, a tentative agreement, fragile but real, that you'll go. You look around the room at your mother's tear-streaked face, your sister's careful, steady presence, your husband's exhausted relief at finally having said everything he's been carrying, and you feel, underneath the shame and the fear, something that might be the first genuine flicker of hope you've allowed yourself in months. The recognition that whatever happens next, you're not facing it entirely alone, that the people gathered in this living room, however frightened and however hurt, have chosen to stay, at least for now, in the difficult work of trying to bring you back. Rehabilitation facilities in the mid-2000s look nothing like the carefully curated, almost resort-like treatment centres that would become more common in later decades. The building you arrive at is institutional and plain, fluorescent lighting buzzing overhead, linoleum floors that echo with every footstep, a roommate assigned to you rather than chosen, a woman a few years older than you who's been through this process twice before and offers you a tired, knowing smile when you arrive, that conveys more than words could about what the coming weeks will actually involve. You surrender your phone at intake, along with anything containing alcohol, including the bottle of mouthwash you'd packed without thinking. The schedule that governs your days here is rigid and unfamiliar. Group therapy sessions at specific hours, individual counselling appointments, meals served in a cafeteria that smells faintly of industrial cleaner, mandatory exercise periods, lights out at a set time each evening. You sit in your first group session feeling like an outsider in every sense, surrounded by people whose stories sound nothing like yours on the surface, men who lost jobs, women who lost custody battles, a teenager who looks barely older than your own son will be in a decade, all of you united by a shared, devastating thread that runs beneath every individual difference. You're asked, in that first session, to introduce yourself and share why you're there, and the words that come out of your mouth, the ones you've never said aloud to anyone outside your immediate family, feel strange and heavy in your throat. A confession delivered to a room full of strangers who, somehow, understand it better than the people who've known you for years. The nights are the hardest part. Lying awake in an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar room, listening to your roommate's breathing, missing your children with an ache that feels almost physical, calling home every evening during the designated phone hour to talk to them, keeping your voice steady and cheerful, telling them you'll be home soon, that mommy is just at a special kind of doctor's appointment that takes a little while. You don't tell them the full truth, not yet, not at ages 7 and 3, but you tell them enough that you love them, that you think about them constantly, that this is something you need to do to become the mother you want to be for them. Your husband visits during the designated family hours, sitting across from you in a sterile visiting room, both of you working through conversations that are tender and difficult in equal measure, rebuilding something between you that still feels fragile and uncertain. Treatment, you discover, is not the dramatic cinematic transformation you might have imagined from movies, but something slower and more grinding. Group sessions that sometimes feel repetitive, individual counselling that forces you to examine parts of yourself you'd rather leave unexamined, the slow, unglamorous work of learning to live without something your body and mind have spent the past year believing they couldn't function without. By the time your 30 days are up, you don't feel cured exactly, but you feel different, lighter in some ways, steadier in others, carrying a fragile new toolkit. You're not entirely sure will hold once you're back in the world that originally undid you. Your husband picks you up on a Tuesday morning, the same kind of unremarkable weekday morning the entire story began on, except now everything about how you experience it feels different, sharper somehow, every detail more vivid than it has any right to be. You sign the discharge paperwork, collect the few belongings you'd brought with you, hug your roommate goodbye with a warmth that surprises you, given how little you'd known her 2 weeks earlier. The drive home takes about 90 minutes, most of it spent in a kind of tentative, careful conversation between you and your husband. Neither of you quite sure yet how to talk to each other, as the people you're both trying to become rather than the people you were before everything fell apart. The neighbourhood looks exactly the same when you finally turn onto your street, the same houses, the same lawns, the same flag by your own front door that you'd left someone else in charge of changing for the season. There's something disorienting about how unchanged the physical world looks against how completely your internal world has shifted over the past month, as though the universe should have made some external adjustment to match the magnitude of what you've just been through. And instead it simply continued along exactly as it was, indifferent and ordinary. Your children greet you at the door with the kind of unrestrained joy only young kids can manage. Your daughter wrapping herself around your legs, your son talking rapidly about everything that's happened at school while you were gone, both of them simply thrilled to have their mother home, with none of the complicated layers of relief and fear and cautious hope that you and your husband are carrying. The house smells the same, looks the same, but you move through it that first evening like someone slightly unfamiliar with their own surroundings, noticing details you'd stopped seeing months ago, the particular creak of the third stair, the way afternoon light falls across the kitchen table. Your husband watches you with a kind of careful, cautious optimism, hopeful but not naive, aware that 30 days in treatment, however significant, represents the beginning of something rather than its conclusion. You go to bed that first night back in your own bedroom feeling exhausted, in a way that has nothing to do with physical tiredness, the cumulative weight of re-entering a life you'd left in crisis and returned to find suspended in a kind of careful, watchful stillness. Everyone around you, including yourself, uncertain exactly how fragile this new version of normal actually is. You lie awake longer than you'd like, listening to the familiar sounds of your house settling around you, aware that tomorrow will bring the real test, not the structured, supportive environment of treatment, but the actual, unstructured chaos of daily life. School mornings and grocery runs and PTA meetings and every other small, ordinary trigger that originally helped lead you to where you'd been. You don't have answers yet for how you'll navigate all of that differently this time. You only have the fragile, hard-won hope that you might, and the quiet, terrifying awareness that hope alone has never been quite enough to guarantee anything. It happens faster than anyone, including you, expects, and in a setting so aggressively ordinary that the contrast feels almost cruel in retrospect. You're running errands on an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon, several weeks after returning home from treatment, your sobriety still new enough to feel both precious and precarious. You're pushing a cart through the aisles of a big box store, picking up the kind of mundane household items that make up most of a parent's week. Paper towels, a new lunchbox for your son whose old one finally gave out, a birthday card for a colleague of your husband's. Nothing about the errand suggests anything unusual is about to happen. But somewhere between the cereal aisle and the checkout line, a craving arrives with an intensity that catches you completely off guard, sudden and overwhelming in a way the careful coping strategies you learned in treatment feel suddenly, devastatingly inadequate to address. You abandon your half-filled cart near the registers, walk out to your car in the parking lot, and within the span of a few minutes make a series of decisions that undo weeks of hard-won progress. Decisions that feel, even as you're making them, both completely outside your control and somehow, simultaneously, entirely your own choice. You sit in the driver's seat afterward, the engine not yet started, errands forgotten, the bag of items you did manage to purchase sitting forgotten on the passenger seat, and you cry in a way you haven't allowed yourself to cry in months, a combination of grief and shame, and a particular kind of exhausted recognition that this thing you'd hoped you'd left behind in treatment has followed you home far more completely than you'd wanted to believe. The drive back to your house takes longer than it should, partly because you're not in any condition to drive well, partly because some part of you is delaying the moment when you'll have to walk back into a house full of people who believed, who'd allowed themselves to hope that this particular chapter was over. You don't tell your husband that evening, not directly, though something in your demeanour, some shift he's become attuned to recognising over the past difficult year, makes him ask, gently but directly, whether something happened today. You consider lying, the old reflex still alive and accessible even after everything you've been through. But something in his face, the particular blend of fear and exhausted patience he's wearing, makes you tell him the truth instead, this time without the elaborate justifications or careful misdirection you might once have offered. He doesn't yell. He doesn't storm out. He sits with you at the kitchen table, both of you absorbing the weight of what's just happened, the painful, humbling reality that relapse is, for many people working through this particular struggle, not a sign of failure so much as a brutal, common feature of the entire process, one that nobody warns you adequately about until you're living through it yourself. You go to bed that night feeling like you're starting over from somewhere even further behind than where you began, carrying the added weight of having disappointed the people who believed in you, and the quieter, more private weight of having disappointed yourself most of all. The teenage girl who watches your children on Friday evenings, allowing you and your husband an occasional few hours to yourselves, a luxury you've rarely taken advantage of over the past difficult year, begins noticing things that the adults around you have managed, through some combination of denial and distraction, to avoid seeing as clearly. She mentions, casually at first, to her own mother, that something seems off about the way you sometimes answer the phone when she calls to ask a question about the kids' bedtime routine. Your speech slightly slower than usual, your responses slightly delayed. She notices on more than one occasion a particular smell in the house that she can't quite place, but that registers, somewhere in her teenage instincts, as unusual. She notices that sometimes, when you come home from an evening out, you seem present in a way that doesn't quite match itself, going through the motions of asking about the kids' evening while seeming, somehow, several steps removed from the actual conversation happening in front of you. She doesn't say anything to you directly, partly out of the particular discomfort teenagers feel about confronting adults, partly out of genuine uncertainty about what she's actually noticing and whether it's significant enough to mention. but she does mention it to her own mother one evening, in the offhand way teenagers sometimes share observations about the adults in their lives, describing the strange phone calls and the unusual smell, and the way you seem, sometimes, distracted in a way that feels different from ordinary parental exhaustion. Her mother, who happens to know your family casually through the same school community you've been part of for years, files the observation away without immediately acting on it, uncertain whether it warrants concern or whether it's simply an exaggerated teenage interpretation of ordinary adult tiredness. But word, in the particular way it tends to in tightly connected suburban communities, eventually travels further than either of them initially intended, mentioned in passing to another parent, then another, the kind of quiet, informal network of concern that exists beneath the polite surface of most neighbourhoods, watching, even when nobody admits to watching, noticing even what nobody directly discusses. You have no idea during this period that a 16-year-old babysitter's quiet observations have set something in motion that will eventually reach further than you'd ever anticipated, that the careful architecture you've built to keep your struggles invisible to the adults around you has a blind spot you never considered, the perceptive, unfiltered attention of a teenager who notices more than most adults give her credit for. You continue, in the days and weeks that follow, operating under the assumption that your secret remains as contained as it's always been, unaware that somewhere in the periphery of your carefully managed life, a thread has been pulled that will, eventually, unravel far more than you're prepared for. It happens on an ordinary weekday afternoon, the kind of afternoon that an hour earlier looked exactly like every other afternoon in your week. You're folding laundry in the living room when the doorbell rings, and you open the door expecting a delivery or a neighbour, instead finding a woman in professional but unremarkable clothing, holding a folder and a badge that identifies her as a caseworker with the county's Child Protective Services office. She introduces herself with a practiced, careful kindness, the demeanour of someone who has delivered this particular knock at this particular kind of door many times before, and explains that her office has received a report expressing concern about the welfare of your children, and that she needs to ask you some questions and, if possible, see the children to ensure their safety. The floor seems to shift slightly beneath you as she speaks, the careful architecture you've maintained for so long suddenly feeling in this single moment devastatingly fragile. You invite her in, your hands trembling as you set down the laundry you'd been folding, your mind racing through every possible source of the report she's referencing, the babysitter, a neighbour, someone at the paediatrician's office, the specific origin almost beside the point compared to the terrifying reality of what's actually happening. A stranger sitting in your living room with the explicit authority to determine whether your children are safe in your care. She asks careful, methodical questions about supervision, about your daily routines, about anything unusual she should be aware of, her tone professional rather than accusatory, though every question lands with the weight of an accusation, regardless of how gently it's delivered. Your children, who'd been watching television in the next room, wander in partway through the conversation, drawn by curiosity about the unfamiliar visitor, and you watch the caseworker's careful, practiced attention shift toward them, assessing, in ways you can't fully follow, their demeanour, their cleanliness, the general atmosphere of the home they're being raised in. You answer every question as calmly and honestly as you can manage, walking a careful line between transparency and self-preservation, aware that whatever you say in this conversation carries consequences that extend far beyond this single afternoon. The caseworker eventually leaves, after nearly an hour, with a promise to follow up, a folder full of notes you weren't permitted to see, and a departure that leaves you sitting on your living room couch in a kind of stunned, disoriented silence once the door closes behind her. Your husband comes home that evening to find you in a state he's rarely seen, and you tell him everything, The visit, the questions, the terrifying possibility that this entire ordeal might result in something far more devastating than either of you has previously had to confront. The possibility of losing custody, even temporarily, of the children who represent more than anything else in your life, the reason you've been trying, in whatever imperfect ways you've managed, to find your way back to who you used to be. You start attending a support group that meets weekly in the basement of a church a few towns over, chosen specifically because it's far enough from your own neighbourhood that you're unlikely to encounter anyone who recognises you. A small but meaningful mercy given how much of your life over the past year has been organised around concealment. The drive there takes almost 25 minutes, long enough that you have time to rehearse, in your head, exactly how much you're willing to say and exactly where you'll stop, a habit that will, over the following weeks, gradually dissolve as the room itself teaches you that the careful rationing of truth you've practiced everywhere else doesn't actually serve you here. The building is a modest brick church with a gravel parking lot and a side entrance marked by a small, hand-lettered sign taped to the door, an arrow pointing down a narrow staircase that smells faintly of old hymnals, and the particular mustiness that seems to live permanently in church basements, regardless of denomination or location. The room itself is unremarkable. Folding chairs arranged in an imperfect circle on linoleum tile, fluorescent lighting that hums faintly overhead, a coffee maker in the corner producing something that tastes more like burnt water than actual coffee, served in styrofoam cups that someone always seems to be running low on, alongside a plate of cookies that look like they were purchased at a grocery store on the way over, slightly stale, untouched by most of the group. You sit that first night in the chair nearest the door, prepared to leave quickly if the experience proves too uncomfortable, surrounded by a group of strangers whose only shared connection is the particular struggle that's brought each of them, in their own way, to this basement on a Tuesday evening. There are about 11 people there that first night, a number that will fluctuate slightly from week to week as people drop in and out, some disappearing for a month or two before returning, some disappearing entirely, a fact the group acknowledges with a kind of weathered, unsentimental honesty that initially unsettles you and eventually becomes one of the things you come to respect most about the entire arrangement. The man sitting 2 seats away introduces himself and shares that he lost his job several months ago after his employer discovered the reason behind his increasingly frequent absences, his voice carrying the particular flatness of someone who's told this story enough times that the rawest edges have worn down into something more like exhausted acceptance. He mentions, almost as an aside, that he's been sober now for 140 days, a number he states with quiet, unshowy pride, and the group responds with a small, warm round of acknowledgement that feels entirely sincere despite its brevity. The woman across from you shares that she lost custody of her 2 children entirely, that she sees them now only during supervised visits arranged through the court system, her voice breaking partway through in a way that makes the entire room go quiet with a kind of collective, unspoken recognition, several people reaching toward her without actually touching her, a hand briefly resting on the back of an empty chair beside her, as though that gesture alone could communicate what words couldn't quite manage. There's a younger man, maybe in his late 20s, who doesn't speak much that first night but who you'll come to know over the following weeks, as someone who started using after a sports injury eerily similar to your own car accident, a small, strange echo of your own story that you find yourself thinking about during the drive home. The recognition that your particular path here, however isolating it's felt, isn't actually as singular as you'd believed. When it becomes your turn to speak, you find yourself, almost without deciding to, telling the truth more completely than you've told it to almost anyone outside your immediate family. The accident, the pills, the doctor shopping, the word you'd promised yourself you'd never say out loud, the treatment, the relapse, the caseworker's visit that's currently hanging over your family like a held breath. Nobody knows when to release. Your voice shakes through parts of it, and you stop more than once, certain you won't be able to finish. But each time, the silence that follows isn't impatient or judgmental, simply patient, allowing you the space to gather yourself and continue. Nobody in the circle flinches. Nobody looks at you with a particular blend of pity and judgment you've become accustomed to anticipating from people who learn pieces of your story. They simply listen, nodding occasionally in recognition, several of them offering afterward their own small fragments of similar experiences, creating a strange, unexpected sense of community built entirely around shared difficulty rather than shared accomplishment. After the meeting officially ends, a handful of people linger near the coffee maker, talking in smaller, looser groups, and the woman who lost custody of her children approaches you directly, introduces herself properly, and tells you, with a directness that catches you off guard, that the first meeting is always the hardest one, and that it gets easier to walk through that basement door each week after this. She gives you her phone number on a torn piece of paper, tells you to call any time, day or night, an offer you're not sure you'll ever actually use, but that you fold carefully and place in your wallet anyway, a small, tangible piece of evidence that something has shifted tonight. You leave that first meeting feeling lighter than you have in longer than you can remember, not because anything has been solved. Your legal situation with child services remains unresolved, your marriage remains fragile, your sobriety remains as it always will, something requiring constant, conscious maintenance. But because for the first time in longer than you can remember, you said the truth out loud to people who didn't flinch, who didn't need you to perform anything other than exactly who you actually are right now, complicated and struggling and trying, in whatever imperfect ways you can manage, to find your way back towards something resembling solid ground. You drive home that night with the radio off, the silence comfortable rather than heavy, already somewhat to your own surprise thinking ahead to next Tuesday. There's a particular kind of fear, distinct from every other fear you've navigated over this difficult year, attached specifically to the prospect of disappointing your own mother. You pick up the phone more times than you can count over these months, fully intending to finally tell her the complete truth. Everything you've been carrying, everything that's happened, the treatment, the relapse, the caseworker's visit that still hangs unresolved over your family. Each time you dial most of the number before setting the phone back down, the words rehearsed and ready in your mind somehow refusing to translate into actual speech once her voice answers on the other end. Your mother knows fragments, the intervention she participated in, vague references to your struggles that you've allowed her to interpret in whatever way feels least devastating to her. But she doesn't know the full scope, doesn't know about the caseworker, doesn't know about the relapse in the parking lot, doesn't know how close. At certain points over this past year, things have come to falling apart entirely. There's something specific about a mother's disappointment that operates according to different rules than every other relationship in your life. A particular fear rooted in childhood, in decades of wanting to be the daughter she could be proud of. A fear that feels, even now, even as an adult woman with children of your own, disproportionately powerful compared to almost anything else you're navigating. You remember vividly certain moments from your own childhood that seem to explain, at least partially, why this particular fear has such a tight grip on you. The time you brought home a report card with a grade lower than she expected, and watched her face fall in a way that felt, at age 11, like the end of the world, the way she always described other families' struggles, an aunt's divorce, a cousin's trouble with the law, with a particular tone of quiet, careful disappointment that you absorbed as a child and have apparently carried with you well into adulthood without ever fully examining it. You call her one Sunday afternoon with every intention of finally telling her everything. Make it through the opening pleasantries about the weather and the children's latest activities. Listen to her describe a recipe she tried over the weekend and a conversation she had with a neighbour about the upcoming holiday season, and then find yourself, once again, steering the conversation away from the truth at the last possible moment, offering instead a vague, reassuring update that things are improving, that you're feeling more like yourself, technically true in certain narrow respects while leaving out almost everything that actually matters. There's a particular moment during that call, right after she asks with genuine warmth how you're really doing, where you feel the truth rising in your throat, fully formed, ready to be spoken, and you actually open your mouth to begin, only to hear yourself say something entirely different instead. A small, automatic deflection that arrives faster than your conscious decision to offer it. You hang up the phone feeling the particular exhaustion that comes from maintaining a performance even with the person who, theoretically, loves you unconditionally enough that the performance shouldn't be necessary, sitting at your kitchen table afterward, staring at the phone as though it might offer some explanation for why the words wouldn't come. Your husband, who's become privy to most of these unsuccessful attempts, gently suggests more than once that perhaps the relationship with your mother might actually benefit from more honesty rather than less, that perhaps the version of yourself you're protecting her from is less fragile, less disappointing than you've convinced yourself it would be in her eyes. He reminds you, during one particular conversation, that your mother showed up for the intervention without hesitation, that she sat through hours of difficult conversation in your living room without once raising her voice or walking out. Evidence, he suggests, that she might be more capable of absorbing the full truth than you've been giving her credit for. You consider his suggestion seriously, turning it over in quieter moments, recognizing some truth in it even as the fear remains stubbornly intact, a fear that doesn't seem to respond particularly well to logic or evidence, however reasonable. You think sometimes about what it might actually feel like to finally tell her everything, rehearsing in your mind the specific words you might use, imagining her reaction in a dozen different versions, some catastrophic, some surprisingly gentle, none of which you're confident enough in to actually test against reality. There's a particular Tuesday evening, several weeks after that unsuccessful Sunday call, when you almost manage it again, sitting on your back porch with a phone in your hand, your children already asleep, your husband inside doing dishes, the evening quiet enough that the conversation feels possible, in a way it rarely does during the chaos of a normal day. You dial the full number this time, let it ring, hear her voice answer warmly and get further into the conversation than you ever have before, actually saying the words "I need to tell you something" before some interruption, your daughter calling out from her bedroom that she can't find her stuffed rabbit, pulls you away mid-sentence, and by the time you return to the phone, the moment has passed. The door that had cracked open for just a few seconds swinging quietly shut again. For now, the full truth stays locked behind the same careful door it's occupied for months. A secret kept not out of dishonesty exactly, but out of a particular, complicated love. The kind that sometimes convinces itself that protecting someone from painful truth is a form of kindness, even when, somewhere beneath that conviction, you suspect that the silence is protecting you as much as it's protecting her, and that someday, whether you choose the moment or it chooses you, the truth will find its way to her regardless. It happens on an afternoon that begins like any other, nothing in the morning's routine suggesting anything unusual is about to unfold. The kids leave for school at the usual time, your son grumbling about a math worksheet he forgot to finish, your daughter clutching a stuffed rabbit she insists on bringing, despite the preschool's gentle, repeated request that toys stay home. You kiss them both goodbye at the door, watch your husband's car pull out of the driveway behind the school bus, and step back inside a house that, for the next several hours, will be entirely quiet, entirely your own. The particular kind of solitude that's become, over the past difficult year, both a relief and a danger you've never fully reconciled with each other. Your husband, working from home that particular day, due to a scheduling quirk that will later feel like the difference between two entirely different outcomes, finishes a phone call sometime around 2 in the afternoon and walks toward the bedroom to ask you a question about dinner plans, only to find you unresponsive on the bathroom floor, your skin an alarming colour, your lips tinged with a blue that registers, even in his panic, as deeply, viscerally wrong, your breathing shallow and irregular in a way that sends him into an immediate, adrenaline-fueled panic he'll later describe as the worst moment of his entire life. He calls emergency services with hands shaking so badly he has to repeat your address twice. His voice climbing into a register he doesn't recognize as his own. Performs the basic emergency instructions the dispatcher walks him through, while waiting for paramedics to arrive, an agonizing handful of minutes that will later feel, in his memory, like hours, each second stretched unbearably thin as he kneels beside you on the bathroom tile, saying your name over and over, checking for breath, for a pulse, for any sign that the woman in front of him is still, somehow, present inside her own body. The paramedics arrive within what the dispatch log will later record as 6 minutes, but what feels, to your husband, like an eternity measured in heartbeats rather than time, moving with the brisk practiced efficiency of people who have done exactly this before, in exactly this kind of bathroom, more times than any of them would care to count. They administer naloxone, the medication specifically designed to reverse opioid overdoses, and within moments you begin breathing more normally, your colour returning in a way that one paramedic later describes to your husband as almost immediate, almost like watching a switch flip back on, your eyes fluttering open into a confused, disoriented awareness of strangers in your bathroom and your husband's face, white with terror, hovering somewhere just beyond the paramedics working over you. You don't fully understand, in that first hazy moment of returning consciousness, what's actually happened. Your mind struggling to reconcile the bathroom tile against your back with the strangers in uniform surrounding you, your husband's hand gripping yours with a desperation you can feel even through your own disorientation. You're transported to the hospital, your husband following behind in his own car, his mind racing through a combination of relief that you're alive and devastation at how close this exact afternoon came to ending in an entirely different way. The drive itself a blur he won't fully remember afterward. Traffic lights and intersections passing without registering, his entire focus narrowed down to the single, overwhelming need to get to the hospital before anything else could possibly go wrong. You wake up properly several hours later in a hospital bed, tubes in your arm, the antiseptic smell of the hospital room mixing with a lingering disorientation about exactly what happened and how you ended up here. The fluorescent lighting overhead harsh and unfamiliar, a heart monitor beeping somewhere nearby with a steady, reassuring rhythm that you find yourself focusing on as your mind slowly reassembles the pieces of the afternoon. Your husband sits in a chair beside your bed, his face still carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who's spent the past several hours staring directly at the possibility of losing you entirely, his eyes red-rimmed in a way that tells you, before he says a single word, exactly how serious this has been. The conversation that follows, once you're both ready to have it, is unlike any conversation you've had before, stripped of the careful negotiations and cautious optimism that characterized your earlier attempts at recovery, replaced instead with the stark, undeniable reality of how close this entire situation came to a different, irreversible conclusion. He tells you, his voice breaking in a way you've rarely heard from him, about finding you on the floor, about the colour of your lips, about the particular terror of not knowing, for those first several minutes, whether you were already gone. You listen, your own eyes filling with tears the weight of what you've put him through, what you've put your children through, settling over you with a force that feels almost physical. The doctor who eventually comes to check on you delivers the kind of information you've heard before but never quite absorbed with this particular weight. Statistics about overdose, about how a body's tolerance shifts during periods of reduced use, about how dangerous relapse can become precisely because of how it intersects with a body that's no longer adjusted to the same level it once managed, explaining gently but directly that this is exactly how so many overdoses happen, not from increasing use but from returning to old amounts after a period of decreased tolerance, your body simply unable to handle what it once processed without difficulty. You listen to all of it from a hospital bed, your husband's hand gripping yours tightly enough that it almost hurts, both of you absorbing the reality that whatever fragile architecture you've been building over the past year just came devastatingly close to collapsing entirely, and that whatever comes next will need to be approached with a level of seriousness neither of you has fully summoned until this exact terrifying afternoon, a seriousness that will follow both of you out of this hospital room and into every single day that comes after it. After the hospital discharge, your husband begins carrying a small naloxone kit with the same unthinking, practical regularity that he carries diapers and snacks for your daughter, tucking it into the outer pocket of the bag he brings along whenever the family goes anywhere together, a habit that forms within days and never fully leaves him again. It's a small, almost unremarkable object, a couple of nasal spray devices in a compact case barely larger than a deck of cards, but its presence in your family's daily life represents something far larger than its physical size suggests. A quiet, constant acknowledgement of how close the worst possible outcome has come, and how seriously your husband has decided to take the possibility of it happening again. He researches its proper use thoroughly in the days following your discharge, watches instructional videos late at night after you and the kids have gone to sleep, makes sure he understands exactly how to administer it if circumstances ever require it again, approaching the entire process with the same methodical seriousness he might apply to learning infant CPR before your children were born, printing out a small laminated instruction card that he keeps folded inside the kit itself, just in case panic ever makes the steps harder to remember than they seem now, in the relative calm of a quiet evening at the kitchen table. There's something quietly devastating about watching your husband prepare for this particular contingency. The recognition that the man who once worried primarily about car seat installations and age-appropriate sunscreen now also carries, as a standard part of his parental toolkit, the means to potentially save his wife's life should the worst happen again. A responsibility he's taken on without complaint, without resentment, simply folding it into the same quiet, dutiful competence he applies to everything else involved in keeping his family safe. He doesn't make a production of it, doesn't bring it up in conversation unless directly relevant, simply integrates it into the practical infrastructure of family life. The way he might integrate any other safety measure, a fire extinguisher in the kitchen, a first aid kit in the car, a smoke detector with fresh batteries. You catch sight of it occasionally, tucked beside the diapers and the spare outfit your daughter still sometimes needs, nestled against a juice box and a half-used pack of baby wipes, and each time a complicated wave of emotions moves through you, gratitude for a husband who's chosen to prepare for the worst, rather than simply hope it won't happen again, alongside a particular kind of grief at what its presence represents. The undeniable evidence that your family's definition of normal now includes contingency planning for your potential overdose. You think sometimes about other families you know, other parents at school pickup or soccer games, whose diaper bags contain only the ordinary contents diaper bags are supposed to contain, granola bars and spare socks and a forgotten toy retrieved from beneath a car seat, and you feel the particular isolation of carrying something most of the people around you would find almost unimaginable, a strange, private weight that sits alongside the ordinary weight of parenthood without ever fully announcing itself to anyone outside your immediate household. There's a particular afternoon, several weeks after the hospital discharge, when your daughter, rummaging through the diaper bag looking for a snack, pulls out the small case and asks, with the uncomplicated curiosity of a 3-year-old, what it is, and you watch your husband answer smoothly, without hesitation, that it's medicine Daddy keeps just in case. A small, careful truth that satisfies her completely and sends her back to searching for the granola bar she actually wanted, while you stand nearby feeling something twist quietly in your chest at how easily the moment passed, how thoroughly your husband has learned to navigate around the edges of a truth your children aren't yet old enough to fully understand. You also recognize in quieter, more honest moments that this small, unused kit represents something important beyond its grim, practical purpose, a tangible symbol of your husband's continued commitment to staying, to fighting alongside you rather than walking away, to preparing for whatever might come next rather than simply hoping for the best and leaving the rest to chance. A commitment that, on your hardest days, feels like one of the few solid things you have left to hold on to. It sits there, week after week, unused but present. A strange and heavy kind of insurance policy that neither of you discusses often, but that both of you understand, on some level, has fundamentally altered what an ordinary Tuesday at the park or an ordinary trip to the grocery store now quietly includes. A small case zipped into a side pocket, present at every birthday party, every paediatrician visit, every ordinary errand, a quiet, constant reminder of everything your family has survived and everything you're both determined never to have to survive again. Somewhere in the middle of everything you and your family have been navigating, the overdose, the caseworker's ongoing involvement, the careful, exhausting work of trying to stay sober one day at a time, there are still days that look almost embarrassingly ordinary, days that, if captured in a photograph, would reveal nothing about the difficulty unfolding underneath them. One Saturday morning, several weeks after the hospital discharge, you wake up feeling more like yourself than you have in longer than you can remember. A clarity and steadiness in your own mind that you'd almost forgotten was possible. The kind of morning where sunlight through the bedroom curtains feels genuinely pleasant, rather than simply another obstacle to manage before the day's careful logistics can begin. You suggest, somewhat spontaneously, that the family spend the day at the park a few miles from your house, the one with the good swing set and the walking trail your son has always loved exploring. A suggestion that surprises even you in its lightness, and how easily it arrives without the usual undercurrent of calculation that's accompanied most of your decisions over this past difficult year. Your husband, cautiously hopeful in the way he's learned to be about your good days, agrees readily, and within the hour you're all piling into the minivan, your daughter chattering about which slide she wants to go on first, your son already negotiating for an extra hour of playtime before lunch, the ordinary chaos of family logistics unfolding exactly the way it might in any household, anywhere, on any given Saturday. The day unfolds with the particular sweetness of genuinely ordinary family time. Your daughter shrieking with delight as your husband pushes her higher on the swing, her laughter carrying across the playground in a way that makes several other parents glance over and smile. Your son leading you down the walking trail with the serious, self-important air of a tour guide showing off his favourite landmarks, pointing out a particular tree he's decided is the best climbing tree in the entire park, a claim you accept with appropriate solemnity. You pack a picnic lunch that morning, sandwiches and apple slices and a bag of pretzels your daughter insists on carrying herself, and eat it on a blanket spread across a patch of grass near the pond. Sandwiches that taste better outdoors than they ever do at the kitchen table for reasons none of you can quite explain. Your son narrating an elaborate story about ducks he's invented entirely from his own imagination. Your daughter mostly interested in feeding pretzel pieces to anyone who'll take them, including at one point an entirely uninterested squirrel. You laugh at one point at something your daughter says, an unintentionally hilarious mispronunciation of a word she's still learning, and the laugh comes easily, genuinely, without the careful management of performance you've grown so accustomed to applying to almost every interaction over this past difficult year. A laugh that surprises you with how unself-conscious it feels, how little effort it requires compared to the careful performances you've grown used to delivering. Your husband catches your eye across the picnic blanket during one of these moments, and something passes between you. Not relief exactly, not yet, but something close to it. A small, fragile recognition that days like this one are still possible, that whatever else this past year has taken from your family, it hasn't taken away your capacity for this particular kind of uncomplicated joy. Later in the afternoon, while your husband chases your son around the playground in a game of tag that's clearly been negotiated according to rules only the two of them fully understand, you sit on a park bench with your daughter curled against your side, half asleep, the late afternoon sun warm against both of you, and you find yourself in that particular quiet stillness, genuinely present in a way that feels less like effort and more like simple, uncomplicated existence. The kind of moment you used to take entirely for granted before this past year taught you how rare and precious ordinary stillness actually is. These days don't erase what's happened. Don't undo the caseworker's file that still sits open somewhere in a county office. Don't guarantee that tomorrow or next week won't bring another difficult chapter in this ongoing story. A reality you're careful not to forget even in the middle of an afternoon this gentle, but they remind everyone involved, including you, why this particular fight remains worth having, why your husband continues showing up despite everything, why your children's uncomplicated love for you continues to feel like both a responsibility and a gift, why the version of yourself capable of laughing easily at a picnic table, fully present, fully here, remains worth fighting to protect and expand. One ordinary, unremarkable, genuinely good day at a time. This particular Saturday folding itself quietly into your memory as proof, however fragile, that the life you're trying to rebuild is still, in fact, possible to reach. By the time you reach the final months of the 2000s, you've come to understand that your story, however singular and devastating it has felt from the inside, is in fact one version of a pattern repeating itself in cul-de-sacs and carpool lines across the entire country. A quiet epidemic moving through suburban neighborhoods that the broader culture hasn't yet found adequate language to fully describe. You weren't a statistic when this began, just a mother with a sore back and a prescription from a doctor she trusted, and you're still not entirely comfortable thinking of yourself as one now, but the shape of your experience, the accident, the pills, the doctor shopping, the transition to something cheaper and more dangerous, the overdose, the slow, uneven climb back towards something resembling stability, matches the shape of thousands of other women's stories closely enough that you've started to recognize it instantly whenever you encounter a piece of it. A news segment your husband mutes too late, a conversation overheard at the pharmacy, a name mentioned at a school function in a tone that makes you understand, without anyone saying so directly, exactly what's being implied. The caseworker's file on your family eventually closes, not because everything has been resolved perfectly, but because the months of consistent sobriety, the completed treatment program, the support group attendance documented carefully in a small notebook you started keeping specifically for this purpose, the home visits that gradually revealed a household functioning safely and adequately, accumulate into enough evidence that the county determines ongoing supervision isn't necessary, a moment that arrives quietly, almost anticlimactically, a phone call rather than a dramatic resolution, and that nonetheless leaves you sitting at your kitchen table afterward, crying in a way that feels like relief finally permitted to surface after months of careful, exhausting vigilance. Your marriage, meanwhile, settles into something different than what it was before. Not necessarily worse, but undeniably changed. A relationship that's absorbed a kind of stress test most marriages never have to undergo, and that has either broken under that stress or reshaped itself into something sturdier, depending on which particular version of this story you happen to be living. For many women who walk this exact path, the marriage doesn't survive, the husband eventually exhausted past the point of continuing, the trust damaged beyond what either partner can fully repair, the children caught in the middle of a separation that compounds an already difficult chapter in their young lives. For others, the marriage becomes something stronger than it was before, tempered by crisis in the way certain materials become stronger when subjected to extreme pressure, the partners emerging with a clearer, more honest understanding of each other than the comfortable, untested version of their relationship had ever required them to develop. Your own particular outcome, whichever direction it eventually settles into, becomes one thread among thousands, repeated with variations across towns and counties and states throughout this entire decade. A slow-motion crisis unfolding silently behind the closed garage doors and tidy front lawns of communities that, on the surface, look like the last places anyone would expect this particular kind of suffering to be hiding. The pills that started so many of these stories continue flowing through doctors' offices and pharmacies for years before the broader medical and political systems begin, slowly and unevenly, to recognize the scale of what's been unleashed, before prescription monitoring databases finally connect pharmacies and physicians together in ways that might have changed your own early trajectory had they existed sooner, before public health campaigns and news coverage finally begin using words like crisis and epidemic to describe what, for years, individual families like yours experienced in isolated, shameful silence, each household believing, as you once believed, that whatever was happening behind their particular front door was somehow uniquely their own private failure, rather than a single thread in a much larger, much more devastating national pattern. Some of the women whose stories ran parallel to yours during the same decade don't survive it. Overdoses that don't end with paramedics arriving in time, families that lose mothers entirely rather than nearly losing them, children who grow up without the parent who once packed their lunches and drove their carpool, a darker outcome that you carry with you as a quiet, constant awareness of how differently your own particular afternoon on the bathroom floor could have ended. How much of your continued existence depends on circumstances, your husband's schedule that particular day, the speed of the responding paramedics, factors entirely outside your own control that separated your story from theirs. Recovery, for those who reach it, rarely looks like a single dramatic turning point, rarely arrives as a clean, permanent resolution after which the struggle simply ends. It looks, more often, like what you're living now, years stitched together from individual days, some good, some difficult, a support group attended faithfully, a marriage rebuilt slowly and imperfectly, children who grow up carrying their own complicated memories of a childhood that included both genuine love and genuine crisis simultaneously, a mother who remains, permanently, someone managing something rather than someone who has simply finished managing it. What happens next, for you, and for the thousands of suburban mothers whose stories moved alongside yours through this same difficult decade, isn't a single answer, but a long, ongoing, unglamorous process of staying, one day at a time, on whichever side of survival each individual woman ultimately finds herself standing. There's a particular evening, months after the hospital discharge, when your husband mentions, almost in passing, that he started keeping a second kit in the glove compartment of his own car as well, separate from the one in the diaper bag, a quiet redundancy he explains simply by saying he'd rather have one too many than one too few, a logic you don't argue with even as it settles, once again, into that familiar mixture of gratitude and grief that seems to accompany every conversation about this particular subject. You notice too that he's begun mentioning it gently and without alarm to a small circle of people he trusts completely. Your sister, his own brother, the friend from college who still calls every couple of weeks to check in, explaining where the kits are kept in case anyone ever needs to use one when he isn't present. A quiet expansion of the safety net that initially embarrasses you. The thought of more people knowing the precise practical details of what your family now prepares for, but that you eventually come to recognize as another form of the same care he's shown you all along, an unwillingness to let your survival depend on him alone being in the right place at the right time. There's an awkward, almost funny moment one afternoon when your sister, visiting for the weekend, opens the diaper bag looking for sunscreen and finds the kit instead. Her face shifting through several expressions in quick succession before settling into something steady and understanding, and the two of you have a brief, quiet conversation in the kitchen about it that ends not in tears but in a strange kind of relief. One more person now fully aware of exactly what this particular object represents and exactly why it's there. Your husband replaces the kit twice over the following year, conscientious about expiration dates in a way that mirrors how carefully he used to check the dates on the kids' children's medicine, treating this small case with the same unsentimental seriousness he applies to every other piece of his family's safety, never making it dramatic, never turning it into a conversation that lingers longer than it needs to. You find, over time, that your own relationship to its presence shifts as well, the early grief gradually softening into something closer to acceptance, the recognition that most families carry some version of preparedness for the worst, car seats and fire extinguishers and emergency contact lists taped inside kitchen cabinets, and that yours simply includes one additional item most other families don't need. An item that, the longer it sits there unused, becomes less a daily wound and more a quiet background fact of your particular household, present but no longer constantly aching the way it did in those first raw weeks after the hospital. It sits there still, zipped into its familiar pocket, present at every birthday party, every pediatrician visit, every ordinary errand that takes your family out into the world together, not as a constant reminder of catastrophe, but increasingly as something closer to a quiet promise, the physical proof that your husband decided, on one of the worst days of both your lives, that he would do everything within his power to make sure there would never be a day worse than that one again. As the afternoon light begins to shift toward evening, you all pack up slowly, your son negotiating, with the relentless persistence particular to 7-year-olds, for 10 more minutes on the swings, your daughter half asleep against your shoulder as you carry her toward the car, the picnic blanket folded haphazardly under your husband's arm. The drive home is quiet in the easy, comfortable way that follows a genuinely good day, rather than the careful, watchful quiet that's characterized so many of your drives over this past year. Your son drifting into a half-doze in his car seat, your daughter fully asleep before you've even reached the end of the park's access road, your husband's hand resting briefly on your knee at a stoplight, a small, ordinary gesture that feels, in this particular context, like its own kind of small miracle. You make dinner that evening with an ease you haven't felt in longer than you can remember. Something simple, pasta and a jarred sauce dressed up with vegetables from the crisper drawer. The kitchen radio playing something forgettable in the background while your son sets the table without being asked twice. An act of unprompted helpfulness you find yourself silently, gratefully noting. Bath time and bedtime unfold with their usual chaos. The usual negotiations over one more book, one more song, one more glass of water. But tonight the chaos feels less like exhaustion and more like simple, ordinary parenthood, the kind you used to take entirely for granted before this past year taught you to notice and treasure it. After the kids are finally asleep, you and your husband sit together on the back porch for a while, not talking about much of anything in particular, the conversation drifting between small, unremarkable subjects, a co-worker's retirement party, whether the gutters need cleaning before the next round of rain, the kind of mundane domestic conversation that, a year ago, you'd have found almost boring, and that tonight feels like something closer to grace. Evidence that an ordinary marriage, an ordinary evening, an ordinary life remains within reach for the two of you, however hard won and however fragile it might still be. You think before falling asleep that night about how strange it is that a day defined by nothing more dramatic than a swing set and a picnic blanket and a slightly undercooked pasta dinner has left you feeling more hopeful than almost any other day in recent memory, and you understand somewhere in that drifting half-sleep before dreams take over completely that this is precisely the point, that recovery isn't measured in grand cinematic turning points, but in the quiet, steady accumulation of days exactly like this one, ordinary and unremarkable, and for that very reason entirely precious. So that's the day, the year, the decade. Pills that started in a doctor's office with the best of intentions, a system too fragmented and too trusting to catch what was happening, until it had already happened to thousands of women just like her, in houses just like hers, on streets that looked, from the curb, exactly like yours might. There was no single moment where everything broke. It was smaller than that, and slower than that. A sore back, a refill, a closed door, a quiet arithmetic done alone at kitchen table while the rest of the house slept, unaware. And maybe that's the part worth sitting with tonight. Not the overdose, not the caseworker's file, but the ordinary mornings in between, the lunches packed, the carpool driven, the bedtime stories read in the same steady voice even on the hardest days. Because addiction, when it moves into a house like this one, rarely announces itself. It just quietly rearranges the furniture of a life until almost no one outside it notices anything has changed. If there's a thread running through every part of this story, it's that survival, real survival, rarely looks like the dramatic version we're used to seeing. It looks like a support group in a church basement on a Tuesday night. It looks like a husband learning how to use a small device he hoped he'd never need. It looks like an ordinary Saturday at a park, sandwiches on a blanket. Nothing remarkable about it at all except that it happened, and she was there for it, present enough to remember it. Not every version of this story ends the way hers did. Some end quietly in a bathroom with no one finding the person in time. So if anything about tonight's episode felt close to home, closer than you expected, you're not imagining that. This is a story that's still unfolding in houses across the country tonight, behind doors that look just as ordinary as hers did. So as you settle in now, in your own bed, in your own quiet house, maybe just take a moment to notice the stillness around you, however ordinary it feels. Most nights don't ask anything more of us than getting through them, and getting through them, again and again, turns out to be its own quiet, unglamorous kind of victory.